My father tried to drag me away from Anjali's wedding after I stood up and said she doesn't want this marriage while everyone stared. When I begged him to stop, he tightened his grip and hissed, "You've shamed us enough." I didn't say a word. That was 8 months ago. This morning, he sat in the driveway with his head in his hands, not speaking to anyone. I taught my cousins a language that changed our lives forever. You see, my family had this rule about women and silence. A woman's voice was considered poison after her 16th birthday. The silence ceremony happened at midnight. Your father holds you down while your mother sews a red thread across your lips. Not literally, but you wore that thread on your wrist as a reminder. Break the rule once, they'll lock you in the laundry room without food. Break it twice, they'll pull a tooth. Nobody broke it 3 times. Women's silence was like a currency. Whichever man had the quietest house was the most praised in society. At family gatherings, my uncles would compete like kids showing off baseball cards. Mira hasn't made a sound since January, Uncle Dev would boast, spreading his fingers. In response, Uncle Raj would lean back, smirking. That's nothing. Priya's going on 2 years. When the doctor asked her a question at her checkup, she just pointed at me to answer. It actually sounds crazy saying it out loud, but for so long this is just the way things were. And I myself was the loudest person I knew. I couldn't even get through a conversation without laughing at something the other person said, even if it wasn't meant to be funny. I loved singing lyrics out loud and making weird sounds with my friends, so I knew if I didn't find an answer soon, then my life would be over. But I wanted the problem to go away by itself, and one day, it did. I was sitting in 7th grade when Ms. Brown told us that we needed to take a foreign language. My ears perked up, because ASL, American Sign Language, counted. You see, the whole time me and my family were in the USA, because it wasn't until you turned 16 and made the vow of silence before you were sent back to the motherland. And there, you were forced to settle down and have kids. So 3 times a week I sat in Ms. Brown's classroom learning to speak with my hands. Adrenaline pumped through my veins. If she so much as texted my parents about my choice of language, they'd find out what I was up to, and my life would be over. I even didn't know what I was going to do with the lessons, because no one around me spoke the language. But then came Diwali dinner. All our relatives flew in from the motherland to eat at our house. It was supposed to be the happiest time of the year. But during the meal, I noticed Priya sitting by herself at the end of the table. There were tears silently streaming down her face, and she was unable to tell anyone why. She was 17, a year into her silence. When no one was looking, I handed her a glass of water with a note in my hand. Meet me by the garden shed. Bring your sister. I told everyone that I noticed her sari was wrinkled, and I was going to teach her how to fold it properly in the shed. That's how it started. Every family gathering, while the men watched cricket and the silenced women served food, me and the younger girls would cluster together, all desperate to avoid our fate. I taught them letters first, then words. Then we had whole conversations flowing between our fingers. We got creative with practice locations, signing while washing dishes, our hands hidden in soapy water. We developed our own secret gesture. A flick of the wrist meant he's coming. A thumb brush meant save this conversation for later. By the time I turned 15, we had a full network. 12 girls between the ages of 9 and 15, all fluent in a language our fathers and brothers couldn't understand. The older women noticed but said nothing. Others started learning by watching us. Everything crashed down at my cousin Anjali's wedding. She was 15, marrying a 65-year-old man who'd specifically chosen her for her early, well-trained silence. We were halfway through the ceremony when I noticed her 11-year-old sister glaring right at me. When I looked down at her hands, she signed, "He hits her." She showed me the bruises. I watched Anjali standing there in her red wedding sari, unable to object to her own marriage. Something in me snapped. As he started the final vow, I stood up and spoke, but this time it wasn't in sign language. It was out loud. "She doesn't want this marriage. He's been hurting her." My mother's face turned ghost white. There were gasps all around me. The room exploded. 200 guests staring as I broke the cardinal rule. My father grabbed my arm, hissing about shame and consequences, but he froze in his tracks because 6 other girls stood up, some speaking for the first time in years. "We know about the beatings," one exclaimed. "This is illegal," another one shouted. That's when I heard sirens outside. Through the window, I saw 2 police cars and a CPS van. Someone had called them about a marriage in progress. The chaos erupted faster than anyone could have anticipated. My father's grip on my arm tightened as more girls rose from their seats, their voices breaking years of enforced silence. The groom's family surged forward, shouting about dishonor and broken contracts. My Uncle Dev lunged toward his daughter Mira, who had just spoken for the first time in 11 months, but she stepped back, signing frantically to the other girls. The police officers pushed through the crowd, their presence sending ripples of panic through the wedding hall. Aunties scattered, pulling their daughters close. The men formed a defensive line, trying to block the officers from reaching the mandap where Anjali still stood frozen in her wedding finery. I yanked my arm free from my father and rushed to Anjali's side. Her hands trembled as she signed to me, tears cutting tracks through her heavy makeup. The elderly groom grabbed her wrist, but I shoved myself between them. Behind me, I heard my mother pleading with the officers, insisting this was a religious ceremony, a private family matter. The lead officer, a woman with sharp eyes, pushed past the protesting relatives. She looked directly at Anjali and asked her age. When Anjali's lips stayed sealed, trained by years of preparation, I spoke for her. The officer's expression hardened as she radioed for backup. What followed was a hurricane of movement. Family members tried to hustle the younger girls out through side exits, but we had prepared for this. Every girl who knew our language formed a chain, hands flying in rapid communication. We blocked the doors, linked arms, and refused to let them separate us. My cousin Priya's father dragged her toward the parking lot, but she dug her heels in, signing desperately over her shoulder. 3 younger girls ran to help her, their small bodies creating enough resistance to slow him down. The police officer noticed the struggle and moved to intervene. The CPS workers entered with clipboards and serious expressions. They began separating the children from adults, creating a safe space near the entrance. My heart pounded as I watched them approach Anjali's 11-year-old sister, who was still signing furiously about the bruises. Uncle Raj cornered me near the gift table, his face purple with rage. He raised his hand, but before he could strike, my mother appeared. She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. For a moment, they stared at each other, years of tradition warring with maternal instinct. Then she pulled me behind her. The wedding hall descended into complete disorder. Older women who had been silent for decades watched with wide eyes as their daughters and nieces used their hands to tell stories they'd never been able to share. Some of the aunties began to cry, whether from shame or recognition, I couldn't tell. The police started taking statements, but most of the adults refused to cooperate. They stood in tight clusters, speaking in rapid dialect, trying to figure out how to contain this disaster. The groom's family was already on their phones, calling lawyers and community leaders. I found myself in the eye of the storm, surrounded by the girls I taught. We stood in a circle, hands moving in a blur of communication. Some were terrified, others exhilarated. The youngest, barely 9, kept signing the same phrase over and over. "What happens now?" The lead officer approached our group. She looked at me, then at the others, taking in our defensive postures and flying hands. She asked if anyone needed medical attention. When several girls nodded, she called for paramedics. My father finally broke through the crowd to reach me. His face was a mask of controlled fury. He grabbed my shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. But before he could speak, Anjali stepped forward. forward. For the first time in months of preparation for silence, she opened her mouth. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse. But in the relative quiet that had fallen over the hall, everyone heard her say she didn't want to marry him. The groom sputtered, demanding his rights, but the police officer was already moving to separate them. The next hour blurred together. Police took photographs of bruises. CPS workers interviewed children. Parents huddled with lawyers who had been called from their Saturday evening plans. The wedding food sat untouched on tables while the decorations drooped in the chaos. I watched as, one by one, families began to leave. Some dragged their daughters forcefully. Others moved with a defeated shuffle of those who knew their world had fundamentally changed. The network we built was being torn apart before my eyes. My parents finally managed to extract me from the scene. As we walked to the car, my mother's silence felt different from the enforced quiet I'd grown up around. This was the silence of someone processing the unthinkable. My father's jaw remained clenched the entire drive home. Back at our house, they sent me straight to my room. Through the thin walls, I heard them arguing in hushed tones. My mother's voice rose occasionally, breaking through her usual whispered compliance. I pressed my ear to the door but could only catch fragments. My phone buzzed with messages from the other girls. Some had been locked in their rooms. Others were being kept under constant watch. A few had already been told they would be sent back to the motherland immediately. The network we'd spent years building was under siege. I stayed awake all night, signing to myself in the darkness, practicing the words I might need to defend us. Outside my window, I could see my father's car still parked in the driveway. He hadn't gone to work, which meant family councils were being held, decisions being made about our futures. The next morning, my bedroom door remained locked from the outside. Food appeared on a tray, slid through like I was a prisoner, which I realized I now was. The silence that had once threatened my future had been broken, but the consequences were only beginning. Through my window, I watched cars arrive throughout the day. Uncles and aunties, community elders, all gathering to discuss the catastrophe. I could see them in the living room, gesturing animatedly, their faces grave. My mother moved between them like a ghost, serving tea with shaking hands. By evening, the house felt like a pressure cooker. I heard footsteps constantly passing my door, hushed conversations in the hallway. Then, just as the sun was setting, I heard a soft scratching at my window. My cousin Priya's little sister had climbed the tree outside, her hands already moving in our language. She signed that half the girls had already been pulled from school. Parents were arranging quick trips back to the motherland, trying to get their daughters away before more authorities got involved. The police had Anjali in protective custody, but her family was fighting to get her back. The community was splitting, she told me. Some families blamed me entirely, calling me a poison that had infected their daughters. Others were quietly questioning traditions they'd never dared challenge before, but most were focused on damage control, trying to preserve what remained of their way of life. As she climbed back down the tree, I realized our revolution had only just begun. The silence had been broken, but the real battle for our voices, our choices, our futures was still ahead, and I was locked in my room, cut off from the very girls I'd tried to save. The scratching at my window grew more insistent. I pressed my face against the glass and saw not just Priya's sister, but 3 other girls huddled in the shadows below. Their hands moved frantically in the moonlight, signing messages I could barely make out through the darkness. One of them held up a phone with a text message displayed, "Emergency meeting tomorrow, abandoned warehouse behind the old market." I signed back my understanding, then watched them disappear into the night. My heart raced as I considered the risks. Getting out of this locked room would require creativity, and meeting them would mean defying not just my parents, but the entire community that was now on high alert. The next morning brought an unexpected opportunity. My mother unlocked my door and gestured for me to follow her to the kitchen. The house was empty, my father having left for an emergency community meeting. She moved mechanically, preparing breakfast while avoiding eye contact. I noticed her hands trembling as she set down my plate. While she turned to the stove, I slipped a knife from the drawer into my sleeve. Back in my room, I used it to work on the window lock, careful to muffle any sounds. Hours of patient effort finally paid off when the mechanism gave way with a soft click. That afternoon, while my mother attended to visitors in the front room, I climbed out the window and down the tree. My legs shook as I hit the ground, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The abandoned warehouse sat in a neglected corner of the neighborhood, its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls making it an unlikely meeting place for a group of young girls. Inside, I found chaos. 23 girls had gathered, more than I'd ever seen together outside of family events. Some bore fresh bruises on their arms where parents had grabbed them. Others had swollen eyes from crying. The youngest couldn't have been more than 8, clutching her older sister's hand. Mira stood at the center, her face drawn but determined. She signed rapidly, explaining that 3 families had already left for the motherland with their daughters. 2 more were planning to leave within days. The community elders had issued new rules. No girl under 16 could attend school, effective immediately. All phones were being confiscated. Some families had started padlocking their daughters' bedroom doors from the outside. The girls erupted into a flurry of signs, hands moving so fast I could barely follow. Fear, anger, and desperation filled the dusty air. One girl showed welts on her back where her father had struck her for speaking at the wedding. Another's wrist bore rope burns from being tied to her bed. I raised my hands for attention. We needed a plan, not panic. First, we had to establish a new communication network since our phones were being taken. Second, we needed allies among the older women who might sympathize with our cause. Third, we had to find ways to protect the youngest girls who were most vulnerable. Priya's sister suggested using the old mail slot system in the apartment complex where several families lived. Messages could be passed through the slots when parents were away. Another girl mentioned that her grandmother had been teaching her traditional songs in secret, defying her own son's rules. Perhaps some of the older women remembered what it felt like to have their voices stolen. We divided into groups, each with specific tasks. Some would identify sympathetic adults. Others would create safe houses where girls could hide if situations became dangerous. A third group would document evidence of abuse, keeping records that might prove useful later. As we prepared to leave, Mira grabbed my arm. She signed that her father had arranged her marriage to a man in the motherland. The ceremony would happen in 2 weeks. At 15, she would be silenced forever and shipped away before she could legally protest. The walk home felt like navigating a minefield. I slipped back through my window just as my mother's footsteps approached my door. She entered with dinner, her eyes red and puffy. For a moment, our gazes met, and I saw something crack in her expression. Then she turned and left, locking the door behind her. Over the following days, our underground network activated. Messages passed through mail slots, hidden in grocery bags, and tucked into library books. We developed new codes, more complex than before. A red thread tied to a doorknob meant danger. A white one meant it was safe to meet. Blue meant someone needed immediate help. The first test came when 8-year-old Amara's parents decided to perform an early silencing ceremony, breaking tradition to ensure her compliance. Her older sister managed to tie a blue thread to their apartment door. Within hours, 5 of us had gathered outside, creating enough of a disturbance that neighbors came to investigate. The ceremony was postponed, though we knew it was only a temporary victory. My own situation worsened when my father discovered the tampered window lock. He nailed it shut and installed bars on the outside. My mother now brought meals in silence, her own form of protest that he chose to ignore. I communicated with the outside world through signs made at my window when Priya's sister climbed the tree at night, the community elders escalated their response. They hired men to patrol the neighborhood, watching for groups of girls gathering together. They instituted a buddy system where each family was responsible for monitoring another's daughters. Trust eroded as paranoia spread through our once close community, but we adapted. We met in smaller groups, never the same location twice. We used the school library during hours when we should have been in classes we were no longer allowed to attend. We passed messages through younger boys who hadn't yet learned to see us as property to be controlled. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mira's grandmother, who had been silent for 43 years, approached me during a family gathering. While pretending to adjust my dupatta, she slipped me a note. It contained an address and a time. The address led to a small apartment above a grocery store. Inside, 12 older women sat in a circle, their faces showing a mixture of fear and determination. Mira's grandmother stood in the center, her hands moving in signs I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized she was using an older version of sign language, one they had developed decades ago for their own secret communications. These women had been watching us, she explained. They had seen their daughters and granddaughters repeat their own stolen futures. Some had tried to resist in small ways over the years, but individual efforts had always failed. Now, seeing us organize, they wanted to help. They offered safe houses, financial resources hidden from their husbands, and most importantly, information. They knew which families were planning forced marriages, which fathers were the most violent, which community leaders might be swayed. They had spent decades observing in enforced silence, and now they were ready to act. With their help, we intercepted 3 attempted kidnappings of girls whose families planned to smuggle them out of the country. We documented injuries, keeping photographic evidence hidden in locations our male relatives would never think to search. We created an early warning system that spanned the entire community. The tension reached a breaking point when Mira's wedding day arrived. Her father had moved up the ceremony, suspicious of the growing unrest. The event was held at a private venue with hired security to prevent another disruption, but they hadn't counted on the network we'd built. 30 women and girls converged on the venue from different directions. The older women distracted the security guards with complaints about parking and catering issues. Meanwhile, the younger girls slipped through service entrances and emergency exits. By the time the ceremony began, we had positioned ourselves throughout the hall. This time, when Mira was brought out in her bridal finery, she wasn't alone. Her grandmother stepped forward first, speaking for the first time in 4 decades. Her voice was raspy but clear as she denounced the forced marriage of her granddaughter. Then another woman spoke, and another. Mothers, aunts, grandmothers, all breaking their silence in a cascade of long-suppressed voices. The men in the room stood frozen, unprepared for this coordinated rebellion. Some tried to physically silence their wives and mothers, but we had planned for this. The younger girls formed protective circles around the speakers, using our bodies as shields. We signed rapidly to coordinate our movements, a language of resistance they couldn't understand or stop. Mira herself finally spoke, her voice strong despite years of preparation for silence. She refused the marriage, declared her intention to finish school, to choose her own future. The groom's family withdrew in disgust, declaring the family dishonored and the marriage contract void. But our victory was short-lived. The community leaders called an emergency meeting that night. New rules were announced. Any woman who had broken her silence would be exiled from the community. Their families would be shunned, their businesses boycotted. Men who couldn't control their women would lose their standing and support. The pressure was immediate and intense. Some families cracked, sending their rebellious daughters away to relatives or locking them in indefinite isolation. Others doubled down on restrictions, installing cameras in homes and tracking devices on the few phones that remained. The community split into factions, with violence erupting between those who supported tradition and those who questioned it. I remained locked in my room, but the network continued to function. Messages flowed through our secret channels, reporting on who had been sent away, who was in danger, who needed help. The older women used their years of experience to anticipate and counter many moves, but we were fighting a losing battle against entrenched power. Then came the night when everything changed. My father entered my room with 2 men I didn't recognize. They carried rope and a cloth bag. I knew immediately what was happening. Other girls had been disappeared this way, bundled off to remote locations where they could be married without interference. But I was ready. The moment they approached, I let out a scream that had been building for weeks. It was answered by voices throughout the neighborhood. Girls and women in homes all around began screaming, singing, shouting, making every sound that had been forbidden to them. The cacophony was deafening, lights flicking on in windows as the night erupted with female voices. My father and his accomplices froze, uncertain how to proceed with the entire neighborhood in uproar. Through my window, I could see women emerging from their homes, some still in nightclothes, all adding their voices to the chorus. Police sirens wailed in the distance, called by concerned neighbors outside our community who didn't understand what was happening. In the confusion, my mother appeared in my doorway. She looked at my father, then at me, then at the men with their rope. Without a word, she stepped between us. My father raised his hand to strike her, but she caught his wrist. For a moment, they stood frozen, years of obedience warring with maternal instinct. Then she spoke, not in a whisper, not in deference, but in a clear, commanding voice. She told him to leave. She told him she was done watching her daughter suffer for traditions that had stolen her own life. She told him that if he wanted to take me, he would have to go through her. The standoff stretched on as voices continued to fill the night. Finally, my father lowered his hand. He gestured to the men, and they left, their plan foiled by the collective power of voices that refused to be silenced. But I knew this was far from over. The community was fracturing, battle lines being drawn. Some families fled entirely, unable to reconcile their traditions with their daughters' demands for freedom. Others dug in deeper, convinced that crushing this rebellion was the only way to preserve their way of life. As dawn broke over our neighborhood, I stood at my window, watching women and girls emerge from their homes. Some bore bruises from the night's confrontations. Others looked shell-shocked, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had done. But all of them were looking up, meeting each other's eyes, their hands moving in our shared language of resistance. The war for our voices had truly begun, and there would be no going back. Every girl who had learned to sign, every woman who had broken her silence, every mother who had chosen her daughter over tradition was now part of something larger than themselves. We had tasted freedom, and we would not willingly return to silence. My mother unlocked my door that morning, and for the first time in weeks, left it open. She didn't speak, but her hands moved in the signs I had taught her through the keyhole during long, dark nights. The message was simple, but profound. We fight together now. The days that followed blurred into a pattern of resistance and retaliation. My mother's defiance had shifted something fundamental in our household. She began leaving my door unlocked during the day, though my father installed a camera in the hallway to monitor my movements. I watched him through my window as he met with other fathers in our driveway, their faces dark with determination. One morning, I found my mother in the kitchen, her hands moving in the signs I'd taught her. She gestured toward a grocery list on the counter, but her fingers spelled out a different message entirely. Uncle Dev was planning to take Mira across the border that night. 3 other families would follow within days. The community had decided that removing the corrupted daughters was the only solution. I grabbed a pencil and wrote my own grocery additions while signing back. We needed to warn the others immediately. My mother nodded, tucking the list into her purse. As she left for the market, I noticed her shoulders seemed straighter than they had in years. The camera in the hallway meant I couldn't leave my room undetected, but Priya's sister still climbed the tree outside my window each evening. Through her, I sent coded messages to the network. The older women who had joined our cause began visiting each other's homes under the pretense of planning a religious festival. In reality, they were creating an underground railroad of sorts, moving girls between safe houses when their families became too dangerous. My father's response came swiftly. He removed the tree outside my window, leaving me truly isolated, but my mother had anticipated this. She began incorporating our sign language into her daily routines, dusting my bookshelf while her hands conveyed updates about the other girls. Through her, I learned that Amara's family had attempted another silencing ceremony, but her grandmother had hidden her in a storage closet until they gave up. The real test came when Uncle Dev arrived at our house with Mira. She sat in our living room, her eyes vacant, a fresh bruise darkening her left cheek. Her father announced proudly that she had finally learned proper submission. My mother served tea with steady hands, but I saw her fingers tremble as she set down the tray. That night, I heard movement in the hallway. My door opened silently, and Mira slipped inside. Her hands flew in desperate signs, explaining that her father planned to drive her to the airport at dawn. She had overheard him booking a one-way ticket. Once she crossed into the motherland, she would disappear into an arranged marriage with no way to return. My mother appeared in the doorway, gesturing urgently. Together, we helped Mira climb out through the bathroom window, the only one my father hadn't barred. My mother handed her an envelope containing money she had hidden over the years, small amounts skimmed from grocery budgets and saved in secret. It wasn't much, but it might buy Mira time to reach one of the safe houses. The next morning brought chaos. Uncle Dev stormed through our house, accusing my mother of helping Mira escape. My father's face darkened as he realized the extent of my mother's involvement. He grabbed her wrist, but she yanked it away, meeting his eyes with a defiance I'd never seen before. The argument that followed shook the walls, though I couldn't make out the words through my door. By afternoon, the community was in uproar. Mira had made it to her grandmother's friend's house 3 towns over, but her father had tracked her there. A group of sympathetic women had formed a human barrier around the house, preventing him from dragging her out. The standoff lasted hours, with neighbors calling the police about the disturbance. My father's solution was typically harsh. He announced that our family would return to the motherland immediately. My 16th birthday was still months away, but he wouldn't risk waiting. My mother protested, but he had already begun making arrangements. Our house would be sold, his business transferred to his brother. That night, my mother came to my room with scissors. She cut the camera cable in the hallway, then helped me pack a small bag. Her hands signed instructions as she worked. The network had arranged for me to stay with a distant relative who had broken from the community years ago. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would buy us time. The escape attempt failed. My father had anticipated our move and was waiting in the garage with 2 of his brothers. They separated us immediately, locking my mother in their bedroom and me in mine. Through the walls, I heard her pounding on the door, her voice raised in protest for the first time in my memory. The next few days passed in tense silence. My father had taken time off work to guard the house. My mother was allowed out only for essential tasks, always accompanied. The other families in our community were implementing similar measures. The rebellion had forced them to become prison wardens in their own homes, but the network adapted. Messages began appearing in unexpected places. A note tucked into a bag of rice delivered to our door. Signs flashed from windows across the street. Even the younger boys, who had initially been kept out of our conflict, began carrying messages, won over by sisters who had always been kind to them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My father's mother arrived from the motherland for an unscheduled visit. She was a formidable woman who had never quite approved of her son's strictness. She took one look at our household, with its locks and cameras and the tension that hung in the air like smoke, and her expression hardened. She began questioning my father about his methods. When he explained about the corruption spreading through the community's daughters, she laughed. It was a bitter sound, full of years of suppressed frustration. She told him about her own silencing ceremony decades ago, how she had spent her first year of marriage planning to run away before finally accepting her fate. My father tried to dismiss her concerns, but she persisted. She had come to America to see her granddaughter before the silencing, she said, and she was appalled by what she found. The traditions had become twisted, turned into something cruel beyond recognition. In her day, the silence had been a spiritual practice. Now it was a tool of control. Her words carried weight that ours never could. Other grandmothers began arriving, summoned by their daughters who had found courage in collective action. These women had lived through the system and emerged on the other side. They spoke with authority about how the traditions had been corrupted, how the men had turned sacred practices into instruments of oppression. The community meetings that followed were heated. Fathers argued with grandmothers, mothers found their voices after years of silence, and daughters signed frantically to translate for those who couldn't speak. My father tried to maintain control, but the foundation of his authority was cracking. The turning point came when Anjali's grandmother revealed something that shocked everyone. She pulled out old photographs and documents, showing that the silencing tradition had originally been voluntary, a choice made by women seeking spiritual enlightenment. It had never been meant as a lifelong sentence, and certainly not for girls as young as 16. The revelation split the community further. Some families doubled down, insisting that the modern interpretation was correct. Others began to question everything they had believed. My own grandmother stood in our living room, facing my father with tears in her eyes, asking him when he had become someone who would lock up his own daughter. Through it all, our network continued to operate. Girls who had been sent away found ways to contact us. Mira had enrolled in school in her new town, living with a cousin who had escaped years earlier. Others weren't so fortunate, trapped in marriages they hadn't chosen, but even they managed to send word that they were surviving. My father's control finally shattered completely when my mother announced she was leaving. She had found a job through one of the network women and rented a small apartment. She would take me with her. The law was on her side, and more importantly, so was his mother. The shame of a broken family was nothing compared to the shame of what he had become. The day we left, I saw my father standing in the doorway, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. His brothers had abandoned him, choosing to adapt rather than lose their own families. The community he had fought to preserve was transforming with or without him. Our new apartment was tiny but filled with light. Other women and girls visited constantly, sharing meals and stories. Some still wore their red threads, but now as reminders of what they had overcome rather than symbols of oppression. The sign language that had once been our secret rebellion became our common tongue, bridging the gap between those who could speak and those still finding their voices. Months later, I watched through the window as more families arrived in our building. The network had evolved into something larger, a support system for those breaking free from traditions that no longer serve them. My mother had become a coordinator, helping women find jobs and housing. Her voice, silent for so many years, now guided others toward freedom. The community we left behind continued to fracture and reform. Some families found ways to honor their heritage while embracing change. Others clung to the old ways, but their numbers dwindled as daughters and wives found the courage to choose their own paths. The silence that had once defined us became just one of many choices, no longer a destiny imposed at 16. I started school again, my hands still flying in sign language whenever I spoke with the other girls. We had created something that couldn't be destroyed, a language of resistance that had become a language of connection. The threads that once bound us now wove us together. Red reminders transformed into symbols of strength. My father eventually reached out through my grandmother. He had questions about the life we had built, about whether there might be room for him in it if he was willing to change. My mother left that decision to me. I hadn't answered yet, but I knew that whatever choice I made would be mine to make. The voice I had fought so hard to keep was finally, truly free.